The discussion today is essentially about consumer behavior in pandemic times. So, are we going crazy, or are consumers just being a little panicked? Are they a little nervous? So let's, journey into understanding panicked consumer behavior. So obviously, let's start off with a little bit about myself. So my name's Nabil. I'm a dentist, and after dentistry, I got into marketing. I did research in consumer behavior. I got involved in entrepreneurship with MIT's boot camps in 2017. I've taught consumer behavior at business schools across Australia, and I've been consulting in marketing for a while now. So just to talk a little bit about my hobbies, I'm pretty basic, I think. Like most of you, I have pretty basic hobbies like traveling, hiking, and, checking out different volcanoes across the world. And I'm also into scuba diving and motorcycling, but not necessarily both of them at the same time. I wouldn't recommend it. All right, so why is this so important? So first and foremost, we're all consumers ourselves, right? And if anything, at the very least, by the end of this session, I want all of you to be able to understand your own selves in the way you make decisions when it comes to buying stuff. Because once you do, it'll help you relate personally with your customers in a better way. And obviously, it doesn't matter which industry you're in, because you're going to have customers, and it's going to help address an important question, in these, as cliche as it may sound, extreme uncertain times, like extreme uncertainty. So the question is, like, are you giving your customers, or am I giving my customers what they need at this time? I mean, things are going to change from here on, as many of us have already realized. So for those that, expect, desperately want things to come back to normal, you might be beginning to realize that this might not happen at all. And this is your moment. This is your moment to not panic, take a step back, and try and adapt yourself to the new normal, which is essentially the purpose of, all of these discussions and these new sessions we have. I mean, considering that certain industries will crumble, the economy might just have a hard reset. We don't know for sure to what extent. We don't know the full extent and magnitude of the crisis either at this stage. It's just predictions and assumptions. So now is the time to reinvent your strategies. Now is the time to realign your focuses and, change the way you look at your customers, if not change your line of work entirely. So why not start with, a better understanding of your current and future customers? So here we go. Let's begin. So what happened in this year, some of the interesting events in terms of consumer behavior, was that there was this, mass panic buying and hoarding of toilet paper for some reason, right? You had like this mad rush in different places across the world. This is a picture of people rushing to buy TP in a store in Aldi's in Sydney. And this is basically people, getting aggressive and starting to argue and fight. And, things escalated pretty quickly to full-blown brawls. Like, you got some kung fu action right over here. Interestingly enough, people ended up ordering more toilet paper than needed online. They ended up buying more of it than they would need, like, in years, possibly. Like this woman right over here, she's from Toowoomba in Australia. It's a state in Queensland. It's a state called Queensland, Toowoomba City there. So basically what she did is she ordered 48 boxes instead of ordering 48 rolls like she normally does in bulk, as she claims. And now, she's claiming that she sold them to support her kids' education. I mean, I wonder if she actually sold them at a premium, price gouging and all that. So things have gone pretty crazy, right? Now, this panic buying, it isn't limited to toilet paper, to hand sanitizer, like masks and gloves, obviously. It has been, it has been influencing various other products and services as well, such as, different types of food, People have been stocking up on a lot of canned food, etc. And these are all FMCG, right? These are all fast-moving consumer goods. So there are more products likely to be added to this list. And one of the important factors that determines why people would panic buy certain products is their function, their use to us, their utility. I mean, you won't really have, people having this mad rush to go and buy any of these. Like, that just wouldn't make any sense, buying these luxury products at this stage. Unless, of course, you're buying pure gold, like those grills in the middle, which is, a form of investment, I guess. Are you guys able to hear me? Just checking in.
Going great.
Can you all hear me loud and clear?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So what are the experts saying about, all of this mass panic and all this, crazy buying? So I've summed it up into these 4 to 5 different categories, essentially, right? So you can have a read at this slide, what different experts have said. This is probably what you know already. This is essentially what most people out there, what most businesses, what most consumers know about already, right? So there's an element of irrationality that, TP is an icon of panic and people are just hoarding it for no good reason. It's just crazy and neurotic. That's one explanation by an expert in the area. Another one is that, toilet paper, it fulfills a very basic need and it's a form of comfort. And well, that makes sense. Another one stated that it's about control and perceived control. So essentially it's about how we don't have control over this crisis in any way whatsoever. And when there's this great unknown, when there's this great external factor threatening your way of life and, the way you look at yourself, the way you behave, the way you interact with people, etc., it triggers this internal reaction to want to seize control. That's what a lot of experts are saying as well. And, they're probably right about that as well. Another factor is what some people are claiming is poor communications. So one professor of psychology stated that in the United States, because people received conflicting messages from the CDC and the Trump administration, people got confused and they didn't know what to do. And the last one is, that there is a lack of a reasonable or a good substitute. I don't necessarily agree with obvious that there's no substitute toilet paper. So this leaves, certain questions unanswered, right? Obviously there are effects of scarcity as well and group influences. So the unanswered questions are, first with the irrationality. So as humans, we can be irrational in so many different ways. And, I don't need to elaborate on that. Like you could just hear any random politician speaking and, that'll just speak for itself. So why is this irrationality towards toilet paper so specifically? That's a question that I had. I mean, sure, there are all these explanations here, right? But I still needed to understand and figure out why it's toilet paper. Like, why is this irrationality so specifically targeted towards toilet paper? It just didn't make any sense to me and to a lot of folks. Regarding comfort and basic needs, well, food and medicine is sort of more important than, than something to clean yourself with in a way. So how come, food and medicine didn't go scarce or there wasn't like a mad rush in certain countries like Australia, which, almost exclusively had this toilet paper pandemonium, to the point where they called it the toilet paper apocalypse. So I think that's a very interesting area to be explored. Also, with this, can this feeling of desperation for certain products be tapped in for other products and services? Absolutely. Like, we don't have a problem with our internet, for example. But if we did, we'd sort of have the same kind of desperation for getting proper, stable, functional internet, as an example. This is a very vague and broad example. The second factor is basically, the third factor rather, is control and perceived control. A lot of consumer behaviorists and psychologists have pointed out towards FOMO, right? Like fear of missing out. Like, oh my God, everyone's buying toilet paper and it's getting out of stock. So what do I do? So obviously, these are factors that need to be considered. And I'm going to expand on this one. It makes a lot of sense. Poor communications, because, according to the poor communications argument, the sense of rationality is completely broken down as a result. That doesn't, to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because surely it can't be it. I mean, it might be a mediating factor. It might be a factor that sort of, encourages this behavior, but I don't think it necessarily causes it. And the last one is the perceived lack of substitutes. Well, there are a lot of alternatives out there. A lot of us have been using these alternatives all our lives or for the last couple of years. And there's so many, and adoption of substitutes is not exactly a very strange or alien concept. So, some of the substitutes are basically, bidets, and, in the Middle East, we have the shower sprays. Basically, you'll find them all over the world. So there are a lot of substitutes. So that's something that's very interesting, that even if, toilet paper is going down in its supply, for example, which it really wasn't, by the way, there would still be this very viable, very normal and perfectly healthy substitute, which is the primary for a lot of folks. All right. Now, there are a lot of unanswered questions, right? So there's one more unanswered question, and I'll get to that after I discuss the timeline and the locations of the toilet paper apocalypse, buying and hoarding, so to speak. So it started in Hong Kong in February 2020. And in that same month, there was, possibly the world's first armed robbery for toilet paper. And you really can't make this shit up. This is hilarious. People were so desperate that someone or a group of people actually felt compelled to go and rob toilet paper. All right. February 2020, there was a huge demand for toilet paper, noodles, and pasta in Singapore. The same thing happened for Japan with toilet paper, but it should be noted here that it wasn't as severe for Japan as it was for example, the United Kingdom or Australia. In March 2020, you had the Australian toilet paper crisis, shortage, irrational buying behavior, apocalyptic trends, crazy apocalypses. You had the same problem start in the United States as well. But in the US, it's also reflected with food. And now the situation, because the situation is worsening, because the number of infected cases are rising, and because the situation is getting more and more out of control, and there are lockdowns instituted, there is a demand for other products as well, food especially, because people have been reporting Costco's and Walmart's and whatever to be, out of stock for a lot of product, and people have had to order, hand sanitizer, etc. online. And Andrew just did that like 2 days ago. I hope you got that shipment, by the way. I hope UPS fixed that for you. March 2020, the same thing happened with the United Kingdom with toilet paper. So here's a question, right? So South Korea had a very high number of infections. I mean, South Korea was like the first after China, along with Italy and Iran, possibly even before. I'm not entirely sure, but possibly even before. With infections rising from a super spreader somewhere, and they had an actual crisis. Australia at the time, when they started hoarding toilet paper, we started buying it as an example. They didn't have a crisis right at their doorstep. It was about to begin. Same thing could be said about the UK. But South Korea was one of the early ones, like with China, and they had a very high number of cases. Interestingly enough, South Korea and other Southeast Asian countries didn't have this panic buying of toilet paper specifically, and neither did several European countries. So my question is, why was it specifically, Hong Kong and Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States? Why was it specifically these countries? Like, if it was, for example, if it was sort of like a cultural thing only, right, where you could say that, okay, all the countries in the world, all the African, the subcontinent of Asia, subcontinent of India, the Middle East, etc., if they use water and if they have a tendency to depend more on water and paper, both, but primarily on water, okay, that makes sense. They wouldn't really care about buying toilet paper. But if it was really an East versus West thing, then why did the other Southeast Asian nations, that use toilet paper not have the same thing happening? And why did other European countries have the same thing happening? They primarily use toilet paper as well. Yet it specifically happened in the UK, in the US, in Australia, in Hong Kong, and to an extent in Singapore and in Japan as well. Although I should highlight this again, in Japan it wasn't as severe, and in Singapore, it was about food and toilet paper, and Singapore had an early explosion of the crisis, like back in February. That's when they had all the panic with the airport, being this international hub, so on and so forth. All right. So what we're going to do is, to address this, to answer these questions, we're going to have a consumer behavior 101. And we're just going to have a few models and a few theories that I really want you to think about. And they're very simple. And I hope that they'll make sense to you. Obviously, there's going to be like a Q&A session after this in which we'll discuss other things as well. So let's spend a few minutes on these models to begin with. So as a customer, consumer, when I go towards making a purchase intention, what happens is that I go through a decision-making process. Now, this decision-making process is essentially influenced by a number of factors, right? These factors can either, encourage my decision-making process, or they could discourage my decision-making process. Now, obviously, because of these different factors, because of these different mediating and moderating factors, the decision-making process is actually quite complicated. But our minds can simplify it, and our minds have various pathways and various ways of making this happen. Some of these, mediating and moderating factors are scarcity effects, whether something is going to go out of stock, or, if it's a product that's very hard to find. And then, there's that influence of fear of missing out as well, which would fall under group influences. A lot of your personal values and your cultural, social, ethical backgrounds, your ethnic backgrounds as well, all these sort of macro environmental factors play a major role as well. Your attitude, a consumer's attitude, the way your mind processes, the way you process, a change in your opinion about something is basically attitude processing. There are different forms of conditioning which influence us to behave in a certain way, which we'll discuss as well. There's something called locus of control, which I will talk about as well, and then symbolic consumption, which we'll also discuss. Now let's start with attitude change. So it has three components, the tri-component theory of attitude change. So you've got cognitive, affective, and cognitive, right? So let's start with cognition to begin with. So whenever you hear of a trend, or if there's something going on, your mind starts to wonder, okay, should I actually act on this? Does this make sense? Is there a lot of rationality in whatever it is that I'm doing? Should I be doing X, Y, and Z to protect myself against the coronavirus? Oh, it's just a flu. I mean, it'll pass, early stages. It's not a big deal. It's just a Chinese problem, whatever, I don't care. But then, no, hang on, the world's too connected and things are gonna change. Okay, I'm thinking. That's basically cognition. Like your mind is rationalizing, and it's really focusing on a way of thinking to sort of come to your decision-making process. The second part of this is the emotions that we experience, right? So if you have an emotion of negativity towards any change, you are rigid and you're firm towards that, then you might not be very open to your cognitive reasoning that, hang on, things have changed. I've got to change the way I act and behave. And this is actually visible in a lot of folks. I mean, the other day we were talking about, in the phone check-ins we were talking about Florida and Australia, right? So people in Florida, for example, haven't been taking things as seriously. Neither have people in Australia, right? So how does it all tie in? Like, there must be some sort of an emotional connection there as well. And the last one is cognitive, which is basically your action tendencies. Like, what do you actually do when your cognition and affective responses have made an impact or have registered something in your decision-making process? What exactly happens with that? Now, when it comes to learning, right, there are, different theories of learning, obviously. So one of them One of them is obviously influencing the way you behave and the way you process information as well, right? So this model sort of explains that, the elaboration likelihood model. So what happens is that whenever you have a decision to make, right? You make that decision through a central route of processing or through a peripheral route of processing. The central route of processing usually involves a lot of cognition, like you think about it a lot, and the decision can be long-term, it sticks, and that's usually a high involvement process. And if it's peripheral, what happens is that there's not a lot of cognition involved, there's not a lot of reasoning happening, and the decision is likely to be temporary, or it might even be unpredictable. This is a low involvement process. All right, now let's sort of understand this with like examples, because I don't want you to feel like this is anything complicated. It's pretty basic. I'm sure a lot of you know about this already. So as an example, so if you were to buy a car, or if you were to buy a house, right? Most folks, when they buy a house or when they want to buy a car, they usually put a lot of thought in it. Like, okay, do I like the design of the car, or do I like the location of the house? Am I happy with what the brand stands for, or am I happy with the neighborhood of the house, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's usually a high involvement process that takes the central route, a lot of cognition, and the decision is long term, right? So you could be like, okay, I've thought a lot about having my own place. I definitely don't want to have an apartment for XYZ reasons. I'd rather have an estate with a lot of open spaces, or it could be the opposite, that hang on, no, I want a lot more security where I live, and I'm just not comfortable living out alone somewhere in the woods or in a farm, so I want to live in an apartment, so on and so forth. So that's like a high involvement process, right? You get the gist of it. So similarly for low involvement processes, what happens is you initially might give it a lot of thought, and then later you just tend to go with the flow, right? So I'll give you an example for this one. Let's say you go to the dentist, because I'm a dentist, right? So say your dentist tells you that, like, dude, your teeth are horrible. Like, your teeth are shit. Like, you need to like take care of them better. And you do all the scaling and you do all the treatments and all of that. And then once you're done with that, like, you ask your dentist this question, like, hey doc, which toothpaste should I use? How should I brush my teeth? And he'll tell you use the Bayes method of brushing your teeth, which I'm not going to talk about. And he could tell you, well, or she could tell you, well, go and use this toothpaste with XYZ chemicals or ingredients. So you go to the shopping center, you go to the grocery store, whatever, and you find that toothpaste which has XYZ chemicals, XYZ composition, and you spend a lot of time looking at different options, and then boom, you make a decision. So the next time you walk into a store to buy toothpaste, you won't think of it as much. You won't think about which toothpaste you want to buy, because it's sort of already registered in your mind. Your brain has a way of doing this. So what happens then is you walk in, you have very low involvement, and you just buy a product. Done, simple. The same thing goes for other products that you might not care a lot about. As an example, say you're having a picnic and you want to buy disposable plates, those cardboard plates, recyclable ones, or plastic ones, recyclables, whichever they are. So all you're going to do is walk into a store and just, look at the plates, find the cheapest ones, and just buy it. So that decision is unpredictable. You could end up buying the super eco-friendly one, or you could end up buying El Cheapo, the ones that are like on the biggest discounts. Depending on what your values are or how you are as a person, you might make that decision. Or it could depend on other external factors. It could depend on your finances as well. And you want to save money because you'd rather spend a lot more on the food and drink. Depends. So therefore, that decision is essentially low involvement, right? Now, what happens is, in this situation, when it comes to all of this, panic buying and this pandemonium that's ensuing, right? What happens is that you have panic and uncertainty, right? Like, you have this huge external factor, and you have this fear of, things that are completely out of control, that are completely out of your hand, right? And this is a very clear threat to your way of life, however that is. It influences the way you work, the way you interact with people. I mean, it's huge, right? So it's a threat literally to your way of life. So what happens then is that for some products and for some of our shopping habits, or for some of our behaviors, right? The reaction is that we have this peripheral route of processing, and Our attitude changes in an unpredictable way, and then it's displayed, it's put on display by this crazy irrational behavior, which is essentially what, you know, all of these consumer psychologists have been saying, but this is the explanation for that. So you have this irrational behavior because of this peripheral attitude change, but there's more to it, obviously. A note on heuristics. So remember what I said about low involved, that example of, you know, buying toothpaste with certain chemicals and composition for the first time, and then it becomes a habit. So whenever something turns into a habit, if it's repeated behavior, it's known as heuristics. That's basically, you know, heuristic. Heuristics are habits, or, you know, repetitive behavior, so to speak. All right. Then, coupled with this, you've got theories of learning. Theories of learning are basically the way in which, you know, you as a person are conditioned to react, or are conditioned to learn and behave in many ways. So there's cognition, which is basically, again, thinking about something and weighing in the pros and cons and thinking about how it influences you, how it affects you, etc. It's all about processing and thinking in this aspect. There's operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is basically positive and negative reinforcement. So there's a lot of operant conditioning happening right now. So people's attitudes aren't changing. People still want to go outside. They still want to maintain that sense of normalcy. They still want to, you know, maintain that old way of life, despite the crisis that's out there, right? So what are the campaigns, you know, what are the campaigns out there like? They're basically like two types of campaigns, like two types in a nutshell, okay? One is literally positive reinforcement, in which everyone is saying, oh, you're a hero for staying indoors, which you are, by the way. We're all heroes here, right? You're a hero for staying inside your house. You're protecting the community. You're helping the old people, the young people, etc. So that's a lot of positive reinforcement. And you keep on getting the message from the experts on the news, from influencers, like people that influence public opinion, famous people, non-famous people, your opinion leaders amongst your own groups. People are like, okay, I'm isolating myself, bravo. So there's a lot of positive reinforcement happening, which is great. And then there's also the negative reinforcement, right? The negative reinforcement is like, yo, if you go outside, and if you're gonna be outside, just, you know, breaking all of these new social distancing and quarantine and isolation rules, a lot of countries are fining people and also imprisoning them, like basically giving them future sentences, so to speak. Like Italy has jail time for 3 months, from what I've heard. I'm not entirely sure, but it does have jail time and a huge fine. In the Middle East, there's a lot of that happening. In Saudi Arabia, for example, there's basically any kind of behavior on this is new, by the way, any kind of behavior that sort of encourages, captured on video, people breaking, you know, this new social distancing and isolation and quarantine law. Anyone that's caught breaking that has like a 3 million Saudi riyal fine, and, you know, imprisonment as well. So different governments, different people, different cultures taking measures, different extremes. Arguably, the extreme approach is important because in some places people aren't listening at all. So maybe the same needs to be done in places like the US, maybe. I'm not sure, but possibly, because from what I've heard and from what I've seen, it's not really working there, whatever's happening. But then again, it's debatable. All right. And lastly, you've got classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is very basic, right? So it's like you see something and you have that thing is like a stimulus, and you're stimulated by either looking at it or feeling it or viewing it. So a simple example of that is basically one of the reasons why I stopped looking at Renew's Instagram, because every time I go on his Instagram, I see these pictures of food, and it's liked by all my friends. You could see Mina likes that. So, you know, you basically look at that food and you feel hungry and you feel like eating it. So that's classical conditioning. You look, you see a stimuli, you're stimulated, and you want it. So that's, you know, basically what marketers do in terms of food and all that. You already know that. So there's a lot of classical conditioning at play as well. Now let's link classical conditioning to the peripheral attitude change. Like, how is it tied in? So people are making, you know, these irrational decisions, seemingly irrational decisions, right? there's a lot of information being fed in the media and the news, right? That, oh, there's a toilet paper shortage. There's something going on. Buy this or else FOMO, or else you're going to miss out. So what's happening here, people actually go to the store, the shopping stores, the grocery stores, wherever they're buying their groceries from, right? When they go there, they look at all these empty shelves, right? And toilet paper takes a lot of space in these stores. They look at all these empty shelves, and what they feel is that, okay, these shelves are empty and there's a big list that says toilet paper on them, which means that there's a shortage of this. And even though I have enough, you never know when you're going to get more, or I'm going to make this irrational decision and buy it, like monkey see, monkey do sort of thing. And that's actually happening. There's a bit of classical conditioning happening with all the imagery that's out there and the peripheral attitude that's at the same time. All right, so let's talk about a couple of more factors that can influence this, right? So group influences, like if you're part of a group that's going out shopping, that wants to stock up on certain things, you feel the same urge and the same need, you have the same tendency. And that is primarily governed by something called SNI, which is susceptibility to normative influence. So the norm is what society is doing. That's subjective. That's like the norm. Right? So a normative influence is basically whatever is happening out there. Like think of pop culture as normative influence. Think of everything that your friends are doing as a normative influence. So a susceptibility to this is basically when you are considering how likely you are to be influenced by your friends. Like, are you less likely or are you more likely? So obviously, individuals with high SNI are more likely to go out there and, repeat a certain behavior. To what extent? It depends on the person. So it could be as simple as, for example, in our group, Monica was concerned about cash, and Andrew and everyone in the group was like, okay, we all took out cash from an ATM. We all have cash just in case. And Monica was like, damn, that's a good point. I should do the same. So fair enough. There's that normative influence that's taking place. And in this case, it's reasonable. And as a result of that, she went out and got some money out from the bank the next day. So again, this is, dependent on a lot of other factors as well. Like these are all codependent factors, right? So remember that chart about decision-making? So the decision-making process is influenced by a lot of different factors. This is one of them. So people who are actually going out there and buying toilet paper and these products that don't make any sense do have this influence from different opinion leaders, from different groups. And basically this ties in with your FOMO as well, your fear of missing out. So that's your subjective norms and your SNI. There are a lot of cultural, ethical, and values-based factors at play as well. So for example, if your values are, I want to share and I don't want to hoard, I don't want to buy enough. So you might personally limit yourself from behaving this way, even though you're tempted to. An intrinsic part of you, because of looking at society around you, are sort of tempted towards behaving in that way, but you stop yourself because you might have this value that's underlying, or you might have this cultural or ethical principle inside of you that's embedded in you that might be at play. Personality traits play a huge role as well in the group influences, in the conditioning. The big 5 traits are worth mentioning here, right? So you've got the openness, the ocean model, right? So openness, conscientiousness, you've got extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So people that are, more neurotic, more agreeable, they might tend to have very high SNI, or they might tend to sort of be influenced by certain people that they might perceive as a part of their own group. Then there are 3-4 other factors which are worth mentioning and are important. There's the need for cognition, which is basically a need that you might have to get more information about something. So one thing in common about all of us in this, watching this presentation and that are partaking in this presentation, is that we all have high NFC, high need for cognition. And that's the reason why we want to gain more knowledge. We're interested in this. We want to prepare. We want to give businesses the right answers. We want to find solutions for this and sort of, get things done the right way. Then there's the need for uniqueness. Need for uniqueness basically is how people want to be different. So could it be the case that certain young people, certain, youth, travelers, backpackers, people that are living a certain kind of lifestyle, could be in Australia and Florida, could it be that they have this high NFU, this high need for uniqueness, that they feel that they don't want to follow the norm and be like the rest of the world and lock themselves down in quarantine and practice social distancing? And they're like, YOLO, you only live once, all of that. So could it be influenced by the NFU, the need for uniqueness? Possibly. Frugality is important because that's basically an attitude that people have, to be conservative and to not spend enough to plan ahead. Crisis management, mitigation, that does play a role over here as well, not to get into too much detail on that. And the last one, which is very important, is the locus of control, LOC, right? So locus of control basically consists of extrinsic and intrinsic factors. So the external factors for the locus of control. So what is the locus of control? Getting a bit ahead of myself. It's basically perceived control of any given situation. That's essentially what it is, right? Textbooks might define it differently, but that's the meaning of it. So it could be external, it could be internal. The external locus of control is, well, there's a crisis, there's this big, virus out there, it's a dangerous disease, I have no control over it. That's an extrinsic factor, it's an external factor. The internal or the intrinsic factor is, okay, so there's a virus out there and it's dangerous. People have died, people are dying, left, right, and center. Have I taken enough precautions? Have I done my part? Have I done enough to ensure my safety or my family's safety? That's a part of your internal LOC, your internal locus of control. And that's definitely playing out over here. So the locus of control is clearly, unbalanced at this time because people have this huge fear of this contagion, right? Because they could die, which is a very rational and normal fear to have. And as a result of this, they feel less, right? So the internal locus of control is trying to balance out that horrible externality, which is this deathly illness, coming to people in the most innocent of situations, like people are just meeting people and, it's happening. Meet someone, you can contract the infection. It's so contagious. So internally, you're like, what do I do to protect myself? How do I protect myself and my family? And that can trigger this irregular because you might be having this to change, peripheral processing, and you make all these decisions that don't seem to make any sense at all. But I do believe there's a reason why toilet paper specifically, and I'm going to talk about that in a few moments. So let's talk about symbolic consumption. Symbolic consumption is basically, any behavior that is linked with your normalcy, with the way you live your life, so to speak. It consists of rituals. So let's break down what rituals are. Rituals aren't like, something, so to speak. No, rituals here mean any action or any behavior which you're used to. So as an example, you might be used to chatting with your friends or your family or different groups of people right before you go to bed on text message or on some other platform, right? So that might be a pre-bedtime ritual for you. For some of us, it might be watch show. For some of us, it might just be closing your eyes and nothing at all. Like it's a ritual. Similarly, going to the bathroom, right? Going to the bathroom, going on about your business and the way you deal with it. So in fact, a ritual, right? Now, rituals, they consist of artifacts. And artifacts are usually, right? And these objects, they transfer meaning from culture to product and consumer, and they're linked with heuristics. So in this case, the artifact is the toilet, which a lot of folks use. So when their way of life is threatened, right? The LOC, locus of control, is unbalanced, as a result of susceptibility to normative influences and classical conditioning. They feel very out of control. And this artifact can influence control. That's my hypothesis here right now. So the toilet paper, being that artifact, it can actually influence your intrinsic response, right, to the locus of control being shifted by the externality of this dangerous disease. That's what's happening. So in simple terms, toilet paper, is basically like the behaviors explained before. It's a symbol of this normalcy, so to speak. Okay, so why toilet paper? So this is my hypothesis, right? This is the second hypothesis. The artifact controls the locus of control, influences the locus of control rather. The second hypothesis is that why toilet paper so specifically? Because let's face it, in our lives, every single one of us, or at least a huge chunk of us, if not most of us, have had this uncomfortable, traumatic, right? Now, when you hear the word trauma, you're thinking something of, yes, sure, but trauma can also mean such as a really nasty or embarrassing experience, right? As you would know. So in this case, it would be going to the bathroom and being horrified or mortified, shocked at finding no toilet paper in there and no in there, and not being able to, go on about your business and walking out in a state that's unclean. So that's very deeply unsettling and embarrassing for a huge chunk of us, if not all of us. So toilet paper, for a lot that don't use alternatives, that haven't thought about the alternatives, right, or just are against it, which is in this case water, using showers and bidets and all of that, bidets and all of that. So people that basically are to toilet paper and haven't thought about the alternatives and get this deep-seated feeling of embarrassment and this feeling of shame that what happens if I'm not able to clean myself? This is disgusting. So to counter that feeling of trauma that everyone has experienced at some point in their lives, this is a natural response to it, buying toilet paper. So no matter what happens, I just don't want to have that feeling. It's a very primal and very basic feeling. Another argument to support what I'm saying is, if you look at, the development of children, right? So one of the first functions as an infant, as a baby, is like eating and pooping, excretion, eating and excretion essentially, right? And I'm not gonna go all Sigmund Freud on you, in which case, there's an entire anal phase. I'm not going to talk about that, but for those that have studied psychology or the basics or who know Freud and his weirdness, you would probably know about this. There's the oral phase, the anal phase, phallic phase, right? So there is a basis to this. Third hypothesis, why is this happening in certain countries, right? Question, like, why is it happening in certain places and not the others? So again, this is a hypothesis, and I didn't have a lot of time to look at the indexes, so I could be wrong about this, but I might not be. It depends. So my hypothesis for this is all of these countries have something in common. So Hong Kong has been going through all of these protests, and they've been protesting to save their autonomy. And China is taking over Hong Kong's autonomy, as we all know. And Hong Kong, the people of Hong Kong don't want that. They don't like it. So they have this, this defensive or this conservative stance to protect their self-identity, right? Hong Kong has that. Something similar has been happening in the United States, and President Trump being president is a reflection of that. So he wanted to build a wall around Mexico and all of that. So people have this weird feeling of preservation of self-identity, and which I feel in case of the U.S. doesn't really make any sense at all, because everyone's an immigrant, and the same goes for Australia. But they have this. They have a lot of this. Something similar happened with the UK, Brexit. And Australia has always been like this. Australia has always been, super closed off and isolated. So my hypothesis is that because of their crisis of self-identity, or because of their, this mental conflict that they might have regarding their self-identity, or the way they've shaped their border policies, it might have something to do with this. Wild one, but I think it would make sense at some point. So, not to make this class super theoretical, and not to, take too much of your time, let's quickly talk about future trends, which is something that I promised with this, right? So this is a study from famous consumer behavior researchers, Van Doorn et al. A study from 2-3 years ago. They basically had this nice little typology, right? So you have, on one axis, you have automated social presence, and on the other axis, you've got the human social presence. So I want you to look at quadrants 3 and quadrants 4, right? So with high automated social presence, right, and low human social presence, you've got all of these, different applications like Google or Siri or Alexa and all of that, and you've got these robots that serve you coffee, and a lot of these adoptions have been happening, by the way. And in quadrant 4, you've got something really interesting. You've got service robots in hospitals for elderly care, and you've got doctors working with robots to perform surgery and things on those lines, right? Quadrant 2 basically has high human social presence but low automated social presence, in which basically, it's what we're doing right now. These online phone calls that we have, digital tech. So my prediction is that there's going to be a lot more automation, a lot more social presence with technology to make these online calls and these trends of remote contact more interactive. So, yep, we can jump straight to Q&A now.